Italian Renaissance painting is the painting of the period beginning in the late 13th century and flourishing from the early 15th to late 16th centuries, occurring in the Italian peninsula, which was at the time divided into many political areas. The painters of Renaissance Italy, although often attached to particular courts and with loyalties to particular towns, nonetheless wandered the length and breadth of Italy, often occupying a diplomatic status and disseminating artistic and philosophical ideas. The city of Florence in Tuscany is renowned as the birthplace of the Renaissance, and in particular of Renaissance painting. A detailed background is given in the companion articles Renaissance and Renaissance architecture. Italian Renaissance painting can be divided into four periods: the Proto Renaissance, the Early Renaissance, the High Renaissance, and Mannerism. These dates are approximations rather than specific points because the lives of individual artists and the personal styles overlap the different periods. The Proto-Renaissance begins with the professional life of the painter Giotto and includes Taglio Gaddi, Orcagna and Altichiero. The early Renaissance was marked by the work of Masaccio, Fra Angelico, Paolo Uccello, Piero Della, Francesca and Verrocchio. The High Renaissance period was that of Leonardo da Vinci, Michelangelo, Raphael and Titian. The Mannerist period included Andrea del Sarto, Pontormo and Tintoretto. Mannerism is dealt with in a separate article. Influences. The influences upon the development of Renaissance painting in Italy are those that also affected philosophy, literature, architecture, theology, science, government and other aspects of society. The following is a summary of points dealt with more fully in the main articles that are cited above. Philosophy. A number of classical texts that had been lost to Western European scholars for centuries became available. These included philosophy, poetry, drama, science, a thesis on the arts and early Christian theology. The resulting interest in humanist philosophy meant that man's relationship with humanity, the universe and with God was no longer the exclusive province of the Church. A revived interest in the classics brought about the first archaeological study of Roman remains by the architect Brunelleschi and sculptor Donatello. The revival of a style of architecture based on classical precedents inspired a corresponding classicism in painting, which manifested itself as early as the 1420s in the paintings of Masaccio and Paolo Uccello. Science and technology. Simultaneous with gaining access to the classical texts, Europe gained access to advanced mathematics which had its provenance in the works of Byzantine and Islamic scholars. The advent of movable type printing in the 15th century meant that ideas could be disseminated easily, and an increasing number of books were written for a broad public. The development of oil paint and its introduction to Italy had lasting effects on the art of painting. Society. The establishment of the Medici Bank and the subsequent trade it generated brought unprecedented wealth to a single Italian city, Florence. Cosimo de' Medici set a new standard for patronage of the arts, not associated with the church or monarchy. The serendipitous presence within the region of Florence of certain individuals of artistic genius, most notably Giotto, Masaccio, Brunelleschi, Piero della Francesca, Leonardo da Vinci and Michelangelo, formed an ethos that supported and encouraged many lesser artists to achieve work of extraordinary quality. A similar heritage of artistic achievement occurred in Venice through the talented Bellini family. Their influential in-law Mantegna, Giorgione, Titian and Tintoretto. Themes. Much painting of the Renaissance period was commissioned by for the Catholic Church. These works were often of large scale and were frequently cycles painted in fresco of the life of Christ, the life of the Virgin, of the life of a saint, particularly St. Francis of Assisi. There were also many allegorical paintings on the theme of salvation and the role of the Church in attaining it. Churches also commissioned altarpieces, which were painted in tempera on panel and later in oil on canvas. Apart from large altarpieces, small devotional pictures were produced in very large numbers, both for churches and for private individuals, the most common theme being the Madonna and Child. Throughout the period, civic commissions were also important. Local government buildings were decorated with frescoes and other works, both secular, such as Ambrogio Lorenzetti's The Allegory of Good and Bad Government, and religious, such as Simone Martini's fresco of the Meister. In the Palazzo Pubblico, Siena, portraiture was uncommon in the 14th and early 15th centuries, mostly limited to civic commemorative pictures such as the equestrian portraits of Giotto da Fogliano by Simone Martini, 1327, in Siena, and, of the early 15th century, John Hawkwood by Uccello in Florence Cathedral and its companion portraying Niccolò da Tolentino by Andrea del Castagno. During the 15th century, portraiture became common, initially often formalized profile portraits but increasingly three-quarter face, bust-length portraits. Patrons of artwork such as altarpieces and fresco cycles often were included in the scenes, a notable example being the inclusion of the Sassati and Medici families in Domenico Ghirlandaio's cycle in the Sassati Chapel. Portraiture was to become a major subject for high Renaissance painters such as Raphael and Titian, and continue into the Mannerist period in works of artists such as Bronzino. With the growth of humanism, artists turned to classical themes, particularly to fulfill commissions for the decoration of the homes of wealthy patrons, the best known being Botticelli's Birth of Venus for the Medici. Increasingly, classical themes were also seen as providing suitable allegorical material for civic commissions. Humanism also influenced the manner in which religious themes were depicted, notably on Michelangelo's ceiling of the Sistine Chapel. Other motifs were drawn from contemporary life, sometimes with allegorical meaning, sometimes purely decorative. Incidents important to a particular family might be recorded like those in the Camera degli Sposi that Mantegna painted for the Gonzaga family at Mantua. Increasingly, still lifes and decorative scenes from life were painted, such as the concert by Lorenzo Costa of about 1490. Important events were often recorded or commemorated in paintings such as Uccello's Battle of San Romano, as were important local religious festivals. History and historic characters were often depicted in a way that reflected on current events or on the lives of current people. Portraits were often painted of contemporaries in the guise of characters from history or literature. The writings of Dante, Verragine's Golden Legend and Boccaccio's Decameron were important sources of themes. In all these subjects, increasingly, and in the works of almost all painters, certain underlying painterly practices were being developed. The observation of nature, the study of anatomy, of light, and perspective. Proto Renaissance painting. Traditions of 13th century Tuscan painting. The art of the region of Tuscany in the late 13th century was dominated by two masters of the Byzantine style, Cimabue of Florence and Duccio of Siena. The commissions were mostly religious paintings, several of them being very large altarpieces showing the Madonna and Child. These two painters, with the contemporaries, Guido of Siena, Coppo di Marcovaldo and the mysterious painter upon whose style the school may have been based, the so-called Master of St. Bernardino, all worked in a manner that was highly formalized and dependent upon the ancient tradition of icon painting. In these tempera paintings, many of the details were rigidly fixed by the subject matter. The precise position of the hands of the Madonna and Christ Child, for example, being dictated by the nature of the blessing that the painting invoked upon the viewer, the angle of the Virgin's head and shoulders, the folds in her veil, and the lines with which her features were defined had all been repeated in countless such paintings. Cimabue and Duccio took steps in the direction of greater naturalism, as did the contemporary Pietro Cavallini of Rome. Giotto, by tradition a shepherd boy from the hills north of Florence, became Cimabue's apprentice and emerged as the most outstanding painter of his time. Giotto, possibly influenced by Pietro Cavallini and other Roman painters, did not base the figures he painted upon any painterly tradition, but upon the observation of life. Unlike those of his Byzantine contemporaries, Giotto's figures are solidly three-dimensional. They stand squarely on the ground, have discernible anatomy and are clothed in garments with weight and structure. But more than anything, what set Giotto's figures apart from those of his contemporaries are their emotions. In the faces of Giotto's figures are joy, rage, despair, shame, spite and love. The cycle of frescoes of the life of Christ and the life of the Virgin that he painted in the Scrovegni chapel in Padua set a new standard for narrative pictures. His Agnus Anti Madonna hangs in the Uffizi Gallery, Florence, in the same room as Cimabue's Santa Trinita Madonna and Duccio's Rucellai Madonna, where the stylistic comparisons between the three can easily be made. One of the features apparent in Giotto's work is his observation of naturalistic perspective. He is regarded as the herald of the Renaissance. Giotto's contemporaries. Giotto had a number of contemporaries who were either trained and influenced by him, or whose observation of nature had led them in a similar direction. Although several of Giotto's pupils assimilated the direction that his work had taken, none was to become as successful as he. Taddeo Gaddi achieved the first large painting of a night scene in an Annunciation to the shepherds in the Baroncelli chapel of the Church of Santa Croce, Florence. The paintings in the upper church of the Basilica of St. Francis, Assisi, are examples of naturalistic painting of the period, often ascribed to Giotto himself, but more probably the work of artists surrounding Pietro Cavallini. A late painting by Cimabue in the lower church at Assisi, of the Madonna and St. Francis, also clearly shows greater naturalism than his panel paintings and the remains of his early frescoes in the upper church. Mortality and redemption. A common theme in the decoration of medieval churches was the Last Judgment, which in Northern European churches frequently occupies a sculptural space above the west door, but in Italian churches such as Giotto's Scrovegni chapel is painted on the inner west wall. The Black Death of 1348 caused its survivors to focus on the need to approach death in a state of penitence and absolution, the inevitability of death. The rewards for the penitent and the penalties of sin were emphasized in a number of frescoes, remarkable for the grim depictions of suffering and the surreal images of the torments of hell. These include the Triumph of Death by Giotto's pupil Orcagna, now in a fragmentary state at the Museum of Santa Croce, and the Triumph of Death in the Camposanto monumental at Pisa by an unknown painter, perhaps Francesco Traniero Buonamico Buffalmacco, who worked on the other three of a series of frescoes on the subject of salvation. It is unknown exactly when these frescoes were begun, but it is generally presumed they post-date 1348. Two important fresco painters were active in Padua in the late 14th century, Altichiero and Giotto da Minaboi. Giotto's masterpiece, The Decoration of the Cathedral's Baptistry, follows the theme of humanity's creation, downfall and salvation, also having a rare apocalypse cycle in the small chancel. While the whole work is exceptional for its breadth, quality and intact state, the treatment of human emotions devotion is conservative by comparison with that of Altachiero's crucifixion at the Basilica of Sant'Antonio, also in Padua. Giotto's work relies on formalized gestures, where Altachiero relates the incidents surrounding Christ's death with great human drama and intensity. In Florence, at the Spanish chapel of Santa Maria Novella, Andrea Bonarutti was commissioned to emphasize the role of the Church in the redemptive process, and that of the Dominican order in particular. His fresco allegory of the active and triumphant Church is remarkable for its depiction of Florence Cathedral, complete with the dome, which was not built until the following century. International Gothic. During the later 14th century, International Gothic was the style that dominated Tuscan painting. It can be seen to an extent in the work of Piero and Ambrogio Lorenzetti, which is marked by a formalized sweetness and grace in the figures, and late Gothic gracefulness in the draperies. The style is fully developed in the works of Simone Martini and Gentile da Fabriano, which have an elegance and a richness of detail, and an idealized quality not compatible with the starker realities of Giotto's paintings. In the early 15th century, bridging the gap between International Gothic and the Renaissance of the paintings of Fra Angelico, many of which, being altarpieces in tempera, show the Gothic love of elaboration, gold leaf and brilliant color. It is in his frescoes at his convent of San Marco that Fra Angelico shows himself the artistic disciple of Giotto. These devotional paintings, which adorn the cells and corridors inhabited by the friars, represent episodes from the life of Jesus, many of them being scenes of the crucifixion. They are starkly simple, restrained in color and intense in mood, as the artist sought to make spiritual revelations a visual reality. Early Renaissance painting. The earliest truly Renaissance images in Florence date from the first year of the century, known in Italian as Quattrocento, synonymous with the early Renaissance. At that date a competition was held to find an artist to create a pair of bronze doors for the baptistry of St. John, the oldest remaining church in the city. The baptistry is a large octagonal building in the Romanesque style, whose origins had been forgotten and which was popularly believed to date from Roman times. The interior of its dome is decorated with an enormous mosaic figure of Christ in majesty, thought to have been designed by Coppo di Marcavaldo. It has three large portals, the central one being filled at the time by a set of doors created by Andrea Pisano 80 years earlier. Pisano's doors were divided into 28 quatrefoil compartments, containing narrative scenes from the life of John the Baptist. The competitors, of which there were 7 young artists, were each to design a bronze panel of similar shape and size, representing the sacrifice of Isaac. 2 of the panels have survived, that by Lorenzo Ghiberti and that by Brunelleschi. Each panel shows some strongly classicizing motifs indicating the direction that art and philosophy were moving at the time. Ghiberti has used the naked figure of Isaac to create a small sculpture in the classical style. He kneels on a tomb decorated with acanthus scrolls that are also a reference to the art of ancient Rome. In Brunelleschi's panel, one of the additional figures included in the scene is reminiscent of a well-known Roman bronze figure of a boy pulling a thorn from his foot. Brunelleschi's creation is challenging in its dynamic intensity. Less elegant than Ghiberti's, it is more about human drama and impending tragedy. Ghiberti won the competition. His first set of baptistry doors took 27 years to complete, after which he was commissioned to make another. In the total of 50 years that Ghiberti worked on them, the doors provided a training ground for many of the artists of Florence, being narrative in subject and employing not only skill in arranging figurative compositions but also the burgeoning skill of linear perspective. The doors were to have an enormous influence on the development of Florence Florentine pictorial art. They were a unifying factor, a source of pride and camaraderie for both the city and its artists. Michelangelo was to call them the gates of paradise. Brancacci Chapel in 1426, two artists commenced painting a fresco cycle of the life of Saint Peter in the chapel of the Brancacci family, at the Carmelite Church in Florence. They both were called by the name of Tommaso and were nicknamed Masaccio and Marcellino, slovenly Tom and Little Tom. More than any other artist, Masaccio recognized the implications in the work of Giotto. He carried forward the practice of painting from nature. His paintings demonstrate an understanding of anatomy, of foreshortening, of linear perspective, of light and the study of drapery. Among his works, the figures of Adam and Eve being expelled from Eden, painted on the side of the arch into the chapel, are renowned for the realistic depiction of the human form and of human emotion. They contrast with the gentle and pretty figures painted by Marcellino on the opposite side of Adam and Eve receiving the forbidden fruit. The painting of the Brancacci Chapel was left incomplete when Masaccio died at 26. The work was later finished by Filippino Lippi. Masaccio's work became a source of inspiration to many later painters, including Leonardo da Vinci and Michelangelo. Development of linear perspective during the first half of the 15th century. The achieving of the effect of realistic space in a painting by the employment of linear perspective was a major preoccupation of many painters, as well as the architects Brunelleschi and Alberti, who both theorized about the subject. Brunelleschi is known to have done a number of careful studies of the piazza and octagonal baptistry outside Florence Cathedral, and it is thought he aided Masaccio in the creation of his famous trompe niche around the Holy Trinity he painted at Santa Maria Novella. According to Vasari, Paolo Uccello was so obsessed with perspective that he thought of little else and experimented with it in many paintings, the best known being the three Battle of San Romano pictures, which use broken weapons on the ground and fields on the distant hills to give an impression of perspective. In the 1450s, Piero Della Francesca, in paintings such as the Flagellation of Christ, demonstrated his mastery over linear perspective and also over the science of light. Another painting exists of cityscape by an unknown artist, perhaps Piero della Francesca, that demonstrates the sort of experiment that Brunelleschi had been making. For this time linear perspective was understood and regularly employed, such as by Perugino in his Christ giving the keys to St. Peter in the Sistine Chapel. Understanding of light. Giotto used tonality to create form. Taddeo Gaddi in his nocturnal scene in the Baroncelli Chapel demonstrated how light could be used to create drama. Paolo Uccello, 100 years later, experimented with the dramatic effect of light in some of his almost monochrome frescoes. He did a number of these in terra verde or green earth, enlivening his compositions with touches of vermilion. The best known is his equestrian portrait of John Hawkwood on the wall of Florence Cathedral, both here and on the foreheads of prophets that he painted around the inner clock face in the cathedral. He used strongly contrasting tones, suggesting that each figure was being lit by a natural light source, as if the source was an actual window in the cathedral. Piero della Francesca carried his study of light further. In the Flagellation he demonstrates a knowledge of how light is proportionally disseminated from its point of origin. There are two sources of light in this painting, one internal to a building and the other external. Of the internal source, though the light itself is invisible, its position can be calculated with mathematical certainty. Leonardo da Vinci was to carry forward Piero's work on light. The Madonna of the Blessed Virgin Mary, revered by the Catholic Church worldwide, was particularly evoked in Florence, where there was a miraculous image of her her on a column in the Corn Market, and where both the Cathedral of Our Lady of the Flowers and the large Dominican Church of Santa Maria Novella were named in her honor. The miraculous image in the Corn Market was destroyed by fire, but replaced with a new image in the 1330s by Bernardo Daddi, set in an elaborately designed and lavishly wrought canopy by Orcagna. The open lower story of the building was enclosed and dedicated as Orson Michel. Depictions of the Madonna and Child were a very popular art form in Florence. They took every shape from small mass-produced terracotta plaques to magnificent altarpieces such as those by Cimabue, Giotto and Masaccio. In the 15th and first half of the 16th centuries, one workshop more than any other dominated the production of Madonnas. They were the Della Robbia family, and they were not painters but modelers in clay. Luca della Robbia, famous for his Cantoria gallery at the cathedral, was the first sculptor to use glazed terracotta for large sculptures. Many of the durable works of this family have survived. The skill of the Della Robbias, particularly Andrea della Robbia, was to give great naturalism to the babies that they modeled as Jesus, and expressions of great piety and sweetness to the Madonna. They were to set a standard to be emulated by other artists of Florence. Among those who painted devotional Madonnas during the early Renaissance are Fra Angelico, Fra Filippo Lippi, Verrocchio and Davide Ghirlandaio. The custom was continued by Botticelli, who produced a series of Madonnas over a period of 20 years for the Medici. Perugino, whose Madonnas and saints are known for their sweetness, and Leonardo da Vinci, for whom a number of small attributed Madonnas such as the Benoit Madonna have survived. Even Michelangelo, who was primarily a sculptor, was persuaded to paint the Donne Tondo, while for Raphael, they are among his most popular and numerous works.